This is the Kyosho Ultima RT6 Stadium Truck Build Series. I believe this is part 6. So I have the rear bulkhead and shock tower assembled with the rear suspension arms and hinge pin mounts and everything. So what's left to do here is to assemble the rear gearbox and mount it in. It is kind of interesting that you do all of this before assembling the gearbox, and then you kind of, I guess thankfully this bumper is kind of flexible here. You pull this back, slot the gearbox in, and then screw, mount the gearbox with screws. The actual assembly of all of this is okay. I mean, this whole piece here is actually 3 pieces. There's a bottom piece, and then there's this middle piece, which is the bulkhead that the ball studs mount onto, and then there's a shock tower. So it's 3 pieces. This bottom piece goes on with 6 screws on the bottom, and then you pop this on, and then the shock tower on, and you have 4 screws to screw everything in from the top. The ball stud mounting positions, there are 2. There's an outer one and an inner one, and they don't exactly go in a straight line. It actually goes in a diagonal. I'm not entirely sure why that is. The stock setting is to put 2 2mm spacers under the ball stud, so that gives you, hard to say if it's a low roll center or not, because the starting surface for this bulkhead is already low. So putting this 2mm spacer under the ball stud might just level it out. Like you may recall, if you look at, say, the T4 or the B4 series, this U-brace is the ball stud mounts onto an elevated portion of the U-brace. So you're already starting off with a low roll center, and then you put spacers on top of that to drop the roll center even more. Here, this surface where the ball studs mount is already recessed, and so it looks like, if I take a closer look, yes, so adding these 2mm spacers here basically levels out the ball stud with the unrecessed portion of this surface. Okay, so this is the recessed portion, this is the unrecessed portion, and this surface here is now coplanar with the bottom of this ball stud with this 2mm spacer. So I can't really say whether that's a low roll center or a high roll center, relative to something like a T4. I'd actually have to compare the two side by side. But that's the starting position. The rear suspension arms mount with a hinge pin holder here, and then there's one in the back, and you have these little inserts. These are metal inserts that you put into the front and rear hinge pin braces, and then there's a little 0.2mm washer that goes in the back here. And what's kind of a pain is not so much these pieces, but this whole assembly here, because you have to put the bumper on, because there's this little slot in the chassis that the bumper kind of slots into, and then you have to, at the same time, mount this hinge pin brace onto these parts here while these arms are kind of moving around. And then you put this 0.5mm spacer between this brace and the bumper. So you have these 3 parts that you're trying to hold together while you're screwing them in from the bottom of the chassis with these 3x8mm screws. So these 2 screws hold these 3 parts together. So if you need to replace the bumper, this whole thing comes apart. If you need to replace this hinge pin brace, this whole thing comes apart. And of course, these pieces here will pop out and fly all over the place. So that can be probably cumbersome when it comes to rebuilding the rear, if you ever have to. I mean, you shouldn't. It's very rare to break rear arms, so I don't think you'll ever really have to take any of this apart, other than to perhaps replace the rear bumper if it starts to wear out at the bottom, or if you want to change this spacer. This spacer will adjust the anti-squat of the rear arms. I don't know what the stock anti-squat setting is. This is kind of a typical thing Kyosho does when they give you settings. They just say, put such and such a millimeter spacer under here, 0.5mm, 2mm, whatever, and then you just get some setting for anti-squat. Or for the springs, they have color-coded springs, but they don't give you a spring rate, right? So you don't really know exactly what the geometry is unless you actually measure it. So I don't know. what the anti-squat angle is with this 0.5 millimeter spacer. But the lowest anti-squat you can have is just by taking the spacer out altogether, and the arms would come down, I would assume, to 0 degrees. If they're smart, then they would design it such that 0 degrees is an option, in which case taking that spacer out should probably give you 0 degrees anti-squat. But then that would mean if I go to, let me make sure, no, sorry, my mistake. 0 degrees, let's see, because we're putting the spacers in from the bottom. So if I add spacers, then the arm should level out like this. So whatever the thickest spacer is should get me to 0 degrees. And then if I remove all the spacers, that should give me the maximum anti-squat. So without this spacer in here, whatever the maximum anti-squat is, I don't know, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, I have no idea what they have designed it to be set up for the maximum anti-squat angle. Or for the minimum, for that matter. How many, what's the thickest spacer you can put in there? That comes from this parch tree right here. This looks like a 1.5 or 2 millimeter spacer. So that would give you the least anti-squat. But again, I don't know what the actual angles are. Anyway, that's how this whole rear goes together. Kind of different for sure compared to something like a T4 or a T5. So we're going to put the gearbox together and mount that, with the slipper clutch and everything, and then that goes together. And then we have the rest of the rear suspension, the hub carriers, the CVAs or CVDs, and then after that, a little bit of the rear suspension. So I'll probably, make a video around here somewhere. This is a repeating section of the manual if you decide to do a mid-motor build. So they give you 2 gear cases, one for a mid-motor and one for the rear motor, because the mid-motor gear case has 4 gears and the rear motor gear case has 3 gears. Okay, so yeah, I'll probably get to about here and make another video, and that's it for now. Thanks for watching.